Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much to the North Dakota Corn Council for sponsoring this webinar. I'm going to be talking about managing corn in Western North Dakota, and hopefully giving you some strategies with corn production that you can use in Eastern North Dakota as well. The context for this is that as Jeff and I were speaking about getting our presentations ready for today, we just wanted to make clear that Eastern and Western North Dakota have very different growing environments. Imagine that. And I was thinking to myself and writing some notes down here, and I think it might even be a worthy endeavor to kind of define Eastern and Western North Dakota a little bit better. I'll still maintain, for those of you in the Carrington area, Carrington in my mind isn't quite Western North Dakota when you put it up against, say, Williston, Dickinson, Hettinger. However, that's not to say that you don't have pockets of lighter soils, of drier conditions, of microclimates that might be a little bit more Western North Dakota than Eastern North Dakota. Um, but we're in the business of science, so fortunately we have the really wonderful NDON network across the state, and Daryl Richardson has done a great job over the past few years adding a lot more stations. Um, and now, granted, we don't have 10, 50, 80 years of data from all of these stations, but I think with some time and effort, we might be able to get some more accurate microclimate regions defined for North Dakota. And I'll come back to this later in the talk for why that would be useful. So anyways, when we're talking about growing corn, or really any crop for that matter, but specifically corn in Western North Dakota, we're really dealing with an environment of extremes and a highly variable environment. So in Western North Dakota, we have highly variable dates of last spring frost and first killing frost in the fall. I would say this is true-ish for all of North Dakota, but again, this tends to be more extreme in the West and especially the Southwest. We can have adequate soil temperatures for planting small grains, say, in early and mid-March in Southwest North Dakota some years. In other years, if we're wetter, if we're colder, if there's snow on the ground until the first week of May, nothing is getting in the ground until the middle of the month. And that is very different than, say, the state of Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and our core Corn Belt states. And it's not to say that there's not variability there. But North Dakota really is a land of extremes in some ways. That our growing season can start early, and it can also end early. I remember in 2016 in Williston, my first year there, we had a very cold frost, Labor Day weekend, and it was the first weekend in September. And I'll never forget it because I was teaching an ag an ag outdoors event for kids that Monday morning after Labor Day, and everybody was bundled up. And anyways, the point is, when we look at data from other states, I think there's value in it. However, my caution for people in North Dakota is just know that the variability in, say, Iowa, in Illinois is just a lot narrower than what we're dealing with in North Dakota. And you really have to be ready to respond not only to your environment generally, of course, but also what is the season doing in a given year. And I think variety selection, as I'll spend a lot of time talking about, has a lot to do with how we manage that. Okay, so we can have very variable growing seasons. Also on the back end, when we have that first killing frost, really plays a big role in corn production in North Dakota. Certainly, we want our corn to reach physiological maturity or black layer. It's good to have some warm days afterwards so that we can get adequate dry down and good harvest conditions and not spend too much money on drying that grain after it comes out of the field. This year, 2024, was also, in my mind, an extreme of this as well. I don't have exact dates in front of me, but a project I'll be talking about at the end of this presentation is we had corn in Mandan and Hettinger this year, and we were at almost physiological maturity, I think second week of September, and then we were just in an oven. Really is I think pretty accurate to say we had extremely low relative humidities. We had very warm temperatures for September and early October, and things dried down really, really fast. We harvested those trials 2 weeks later, and that corn was at 16, 17% moisture where it had been 35% moisture, close to physiological maturity just a couple of weeks before. And that typically does not happen. Normally, as anyone who grows corn knows, and also who lives in North Dakota knows, as we get later into the fall, our days, in addition to getting shorter, are getting cooler, and it takes longer and longer every week, typically, to drop that moisture to an appropriate point to harvest. But 2024, we had very warm temperatures in early, mid, late September's, and then also very unseasonably warm for most of October as well. And again, super low relative humidity. And so when I say an oven, we had relative humidity similar to Phoenix, Arizona, for a couple of weeks there. And, we found out what that does. Not only does it push the crop to maturity very quickly, but if it has reached maturity, it's going to dry down a lot faster than anybody was expecting. And I did hear about people harvesting for the first time ever 9, 10, 12% moisture corn. And normally, we don't think of corn as a crop at risk for shatter loss. But when it gets that dry, the cobs can physically break apart as they're getting sheared off the stalks and put through the combine, crack kernels. Um, and it was just really an interesting situation to have corn that was that dry at the time of harvest. So back to the slides here. We know that we have a highly variable growing season length in North Dakota. We do want to wait until soil is warm enough to plant corn, as Jeff said. So the typical recommendation of 50 degrees Fahrenheit, I do stick by that as what we want to shoot for. However, be aware that corn can generally germinate at 46 degrees. So this is the lower threshold at which, once that seed has imbibed enough water, enzymatic activity in the seed to grow that new seedling can start happening. However, it's very, very slow. If we wait until the soil is 50 degrees or warmer, that process is sped up dramatically. And so I think here's a little bit of a risk management strategy. Getting a little bit of corn in the ground before 50 degrees Fahrenheit at 2-inch depth, I think is advisable, especially if soil conditions are good. Again, if the snow's out early, if there's adequate but not too wet conditions, I think getting a little corn in the ground is good. However, as Jeff was saying, looking ahead to the forecast is very important. Maybe we're getting a little bit of warm up in March and you're thinking about going for extreme Southwest North Dakota. However, looks like it'll turn cold, very cold, a week out. I wouldn't recommend planting corn in that case simply because that imbibitional chilling energy and also the corn's going to sit under the ground for a lot longer than it would if the soil was at 50 degrees. And so that's just a piece of risk management you're going to have to contend with. That I think having a little bit out there, especially with the longer season variety, trying to push the yield, could be helpful. But I think that would just be a small percentage of your acres. Maybe something to try on 5%, and really not more than 10% of the acres if that's a strategy you're interested in playing with. When we talk about precipitation, Western North Dakota is also characterized by highly variable in-season precipitation. So Western North Dakota tends to get the majority of its precipitation available to annual plants from that fall and winter recharge. So if we have snow cover over the winter and then we're able to hold it on the field, there's a lot of no-till in North Dakota, excuse me, Western North Dakota, and reduce tillage if we have good standing stubble. The extreme case of that would be a stripper header, and we have nice tall stubble that's able to hold that snow in place. And that's really the ideal situation in terms of getting that water then into the ground in the spring and going into the growing season with good moisture. Now, granted, that doesn't happen every year, but we do tend to get our soil moisture for Western North Dakota from that winter recharge, and then the months of May and June, and then we tend to get dry kind of mid to late July. And then August and September are traditionally very dry. And I'm saying traditionally just because I think where you are in the state, it does look a little different. But there certainly have been some incidents of a very dry growing season. But then, like, a deluge of rain in a small period of time, and so your end of season total might look normal. However, functionally for a plant that's struggling with drought for 2 months, it gets 5 inches of rain, and then it has to go the rest of the season without anything. That is not ideal for plant growth. Um, Looking at the map of Western North Dakota, um, our driest region tends to be the extreme southwest. There are pockets of what seem to be slightly wetter conditions in kind of Montreal County. That Rainbow Valley area, Ray, North Dakota, tends to have higher yields than, say, Grenora or Williston. Um, and then up in north central North Dakota, we can also have pockets of drier conditions as well. But generally, we have this gradient of west to east. And then you overlay that with soil types as well. Um, you can definitely end up in a situation where even though, say, you're in McLean County, eastern McLean County, if you have a sandier, drier soil, you might be facing moisture regimes more similar to, say, Dunn County or McKenzie County. And knowing your fields is a big part of that and what to expect. So corn sensitivity to drought stress, moving on to the relevance of these growing conditions to the plant. Corn is most sensitive to water stress 2 weeks prior to and 2 weeks after silking. So again, thinking about a typical growing condition, if we're accumulating those growing degree days in Western North Dakota on a typical timeline, that would be kind of late June through early August, if not late July. 2024 was also a weird year in that we had a very long, cool, and wet spring, which was great for our small grains. We actually had record statewide spring wheat yields this year. And it was good for corn too, in that it got it off to a really good start, but then we did dry up. And we had some very high temperatures at the end of July that really hurt yields in both small grains and corn. We had air temperatures of 100, 105, 107, I believe topped out at like 109 degrees in Williston. I think it was like July 24, 25. And even if the corn, say, is in early grain fill, the blister stage, those air temperatures are so hot. And we were short on soil moisture at that time that the combination of a dry condition and really hot temperatures, those kernels aborted, and we didn't have good tip fill. So, what can we do about it? Here we are back at variety selection. So, selecting shorter season varieties is a possible risk management strategy to avoid the most sensitive growth stages during this typically dry period, I think is a very good strategy for Western North Dakota. And I would actually favor going a little bit shorter. On again, it's a basket of varieties you're growing. Hopefully, not everybody's putting all their eggs in one basket with a single variety, but making some variety selections with some shorter than you might otherwise pick as a risk management strategy against drought and high temperatures in late summer. The pictures here, this is corn, pineapple, some people call it, when the leaves are rolling um, during the vegetative stages. Even though this corn looks like it's hurting, the corn actually needs to look like this for 3, 5, 7 days, depending on air temperature, before you actually start impacting yield. Vegetative corn can take a beating before you're really hurting, like that number of rows of kernels around the cob, or otherwise injuring those initial ear shoots that are forming at this time. However, once we get into tasseling, pollination, silking, blister stage, again, that kind of 3 to 4 week window around silking, both before and after, that is when we can really start damaging the corn, both due to we can have the tassels emerge much earlier than the silks and shed the pollen. And so we have a mismatch between when pollen is being shed and then when those silks are out and receptive. If it's an oven at that time of year, that pollen will actually physically desiccate. The silks can physically desiccate. And so then they're too dry to carry out their biological functions. And then you just don't get pollination. Corn, the silks emerge from the base of the ears first. So the longest silks that come out first are actually from the base of the cob, and then from the middle, and then from the tip. And so that's why if that drought condition is something that starts and then continues. Poor tip fill is a typical drought response that we see in corn cobs. Again, it's because those initial silks that come out are from the base, and so they're there when there's adequate moisture and they get fertilized and fill. Whereas if we get drier as we go along, we do not have continued either good pollination, so there's no kernel to form, or those kernels are aborted and you can see like shriveled up kernels that were pollinated, but they died very early during grain fill. And again, if you're to pick a shorter season variety that, if everything goes well, is going to be going through these very sensitive stages before this heat and drought stress sets in. And now, of course, there is a potential trade-off with yield. So say you pick a 75-day corn in a place where you'd normally grow 85-day. That's a pretty big difference. But again, variety selection has a huge impact on your yield potential. And if those varieties, if it's a good yielding 75-day corn, you might be getting a lot more yield out of a corn that can fill out its kernels and meet that yield potential versus one that, yes, it has a higher yield potential overall, but if it's going to be getting hammered during its sensitive growth stages, it's just not going to be favorable for meeting that yield potential. And so to make that a little bit more visual, the green line here with this corn going through its growth stages is water stress sensitivity. The curve for how much inches of soil moisture the plant is using per day follows this curve almost exactly. The corn is using the most water per day from tasseling through early grain fill. And that is, again, the point at which if the corn doesn't have adequate water to to carry out those activities, you're going to see it in yield. Um, in terms of later grain fill stages, corn, if you get past the milk stage and into dough and dent, drought stress at those times later season have just a much less, excuse me, a much smaller impact on yield loss per day of stress. And that's shown in this chart down here in the right. And again, that idea of vegetative corn being able to really hang on, even though it looks poor, is reflected here in the potential yield loss per day of stress. That number shoots up again in that silk blister early grain fill stage and then tapers off as we get towards maturity. Um, for relative maturity, also called days to maturity, so RM or DM, depending on the catalog or company you're looking at, this is the current map of maturities for different growing regions of North Dakota. I think this is a map that we could perhaps revisit with some research work using that end on weather data and maybe updating our averages to see where growing degree days and in-season growing precipitation have gone the last 5, 10, 20 years, and if this map needs to be updated. But again, the idea is that as a risk and labor management strategy, I think it's advisable for anyone who's growing large acreages of corn to pick, I mean, I put 2 to 4, but honestly, I think 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6, depending on your acres, varieties to fill out your operation. I think it's advisable, especially for Western North Dakota, to pick a higher percentage of your varieties on the lower end of the RMs, again, to avoid that period of sensitivity to drought stress and heat stress. And also, if you're someone who's labor limited, which I think a lot of farmers in North Dakota are, we have large farms and not a lot of people out there working them. And so everybody's pressed for time. And if you can have, this quarter ready on Monday and you can only cover so many acres with one machine, that it's helpful if some other quarters aren't ready until later in the week, or perhaps even the following week, and you don't have everything all ready at the same time. Again, that's a risk management strategy because maybe we get a late summer thunderstorm or straight line winds and the drier and more brittle that mature corn crop is, the more likely it is to tip over, which of course causes lodging, and it's more difficult to combine, to pick up, and to recover that yield from the field. So having um, different relative maturities, I think it's very advisable for people in Western North Dakota to manage that in-season moisture stress and heat stress risk, but also then on the back end, standability of the crop, harvestability of the crop, dry down, um, and I think there's just a lot to be said for that. So to put some numbers to it, sort of an old rule of thumb that I think is more applicable to the lower Corn Belt, and it's actually in a textbook that was written by professors primarily in Illinois. Um, their recommendation on how to spread your risk across different maturities is the 25-50-25 model. And I think this is appropriate for the Red River Valley and wetter places where you're putting, say, 25% of your crop. Let's pick somebody in Cass County. 25% of your corn into a 90-day variety, maybe even 88. Then 50% into, say, a 91, 92, and then 25% you push for that goal of increased yield with a longer season variety, maybe a 95, 96, 97 day. But I think in Western North Dakota or drought-prone areas, perhaps even drought-prone, you know, quarters and sections, if you're in a place east of the river, but variable soil types on your operation, I think we should really be thinking about a more fine-tuned model to take into account the risk of drought in Western North Dakota. So I kind of work with something like 10% extra early, so 5 to 7 days earlier than your standard. So let's say you're down in the Dickinson area and you would normally be growing, say, an 82, like if that's your standard, I would say if you can find like a 78, something that has, you know, fairly stable yield for that area, like in the 78 neighborhood. If you're extra early, 30% maybe is an 80, 50% in that 82, 83, and then 10% if you're someone, you know, with a little bit more appetite for risk, pushing it to like 84, 85, 86, maybe even 87. But I think North Dakota, the thing that can bite us the quickest, assuming we can get the crop in the ground, is that back end. Do we get an early frost? Even if we don't get an early frost, is it going to be cold? Is it going to be humid? Is it going to be cloudy? All of those conditions slow dry down, and then we're left with wet grain. And of course, there's a limit to how wet grain you can actually harvest. We don't want to plug up our combines. And then once it's in a bin, how much money are we going to be spending on propane, or other sources to dry the crop down so that we can store it. And so advantages, we don't want our entire crop to be at these sensitive growth stages when they're subject to stress. Insurance against an early frost. Again, if you follow, I'll call it the more conservative model for drought-prone areas, we're getting more of our crop to maturity earlier, because I think that's important. Yes, 2024 was exceptional, but hopefully it'll be exceptional and not the norm. And we need that insurance against early frosts, and then also spreading out that harvest labor as well. Um, to remind people about the importance of drying cost and yield versus harvest moisture for corn hybrids, when you're selecting corn hybrids, um, please, please, please look at the moisture at harvest along with the yield. And I would say, just as like a reader of corn literature that comes out from companies, really question those companies' data if they don't present to you the moisture at harvest along with the yield. Because, you know, we're in North Dakota and we don't always have a fall like 2024. Sometimes we have a fall like 2019, and it's really, really hard. And that caution, um, you know, we can play around with these numbers, but, you know, the message here is, let's say a 78-day hybrid yielding 202 bushels, which would be off the charts for Western North Dakota. I know. I didn't I didn't remake these slides with Western North Dakota numbers. And a moisture at harvest at 19.2%. We're looking at a value after drying if we have 6 bushel corn and it costs 4 cents per bushel to lower that moisture per point down to 15.5% moisture for safe storage. If we have an 81-day hybrid that's yielding 204, but the moisture at harvest is 22.8, our value after drying, $1,164. And then like an 86-day hybrid with say 209 bushel yield, moisture at harvest 25.6. Then we're only looking at a value after drying of 1,169, and we have a gross difference of $13 here. And again, the short story here is that wet corn can eat our lunch, and we don't want that. And now, granted, I think again there is some merit in chasing yields on a small portion of your acre to try and achieve those higher yields, but just being really conscious of the fact, especially if corn prices are low, and if propane or their fuel source prices are high, then you really could be in a situation that even if you have a late season variety that's yielding 10, 20, maybe even 25 bushels better than a shorter, it could be not worth it financially on the back end if you're going to be drying that corn for an extended period of time or at a very high cost. So that's just something to keep in mind. And also for folks maybe considering getting into corn or expanding corn acres, do be wary of this. Do be wary of it. So I do just want to share a little bit of data from a current corn research project in Southwest North Dakota. I'm collaborating with John Rickardson, the agronomist at the Hettinger REC, and then we have master's student Kayla Elias working on this, and the North Dakota Corn Council is providing funding. So thank you very much to the Corn Council. And I'm excited to share this with you. It is preliminary data, so that's the preface. We haven't worked out all the statistics yet, but I think we're starting to see some interesting things. So this trial is testing different seeding rates. We want to dial in seeding rates for Western North Dakota. And then we also have the added layer of looking at the flex and fixed year hybrids in a uniform way. Let's see, Jeff is telling me I need to finish up. All right, we'll rock through this. So we have two sites at Mandan and then at the Hettinger REC. We have 8 varieties at each location. And then the seeding rates we're trying are 10, 14, 18, 22, and 26. And as you can see, these different hybrids that we're using, we have channel and pro-seed varieties, 4 are flex types and 4 are fixed. And then our relative maturity, we went with picking 2 shorter for that area, so 79-80, and then longer, 85-86. Same again, considering sort of 74-78 similar, and 84-86. So doing the idea of both a standard variety maturity and also something pushing it a little bit with the added layer of these flex versus fixed year types as advertised by the companies. So some selected observations from this year. Mandan did have adequate moisture generally for most of the season. Yields ranged from 95 to about 145 bushels per acre. The highest yielding variety was 145 bushels from channel 180-24V2, which was a fixed year type at the 26,000 plants per acre. But just be aware this was statistically similar to 129 bushels of Pro-Seed 1974, a flex type at 26,000. Hettinger did suffer from drought stress after about early mid-July, and then very high temperatures that I mentioned in late July, 100 and 105 degrees air temperatures. Yields were only 53 to 79.5 bushels per acre, and the highest yield was 79.5 bushels from Pro-Seed 1984, a flex type, at 22,000. And then interestingly, statistically similar to 67.5 bushels from Pro-Seed 1984, again, that flex type at 14,000 per acre. And so the whole point of this project is that we know it's well established that you typically get similar yields with lower populations in drier environments because you have fewer plants out there in the field competing for limited water. But we really wanted to push it and see how low can we go. And then also this flex versus fixed ear type is important because it's a trait that companies have really advertised in a big way. We'll put it that way. But there's not a lot of non-company data available to really test the ability of corn plants to either, flex or stay similar with their ear sizes over ranges of population. So to wrap it up here, these are some really great photos that Kayla took just last week. This is from Hettinger, Proceed 1984, flex ear type, and then one ear from each seeding rate is in the display. So we have our low seeding rate of 10,000 seeds per acre on the left, 14, 18, 22, 26. And I would say this variety, from Hettinger is doing a nice job. Um, Flexing that ear as it goes, and maintaining a larger ear size at a higher seeding rate. If we compare that to channel 18656 VT2, a fixed ear type, um, the concept with the fixed ear is maintaining an ear size at a higher density to increase yield. However, we do see in this very moisture limited environment at Hettinger, those ears getting smaller at the higher seeding rates. But then also just something to remember is that our corn yields in the United States, those increasing corn yields over time have been based on more ears per acre, not bigger individual cobs. And that's something we can talk more about if you have questions. Okay, so this is a very busy graph, but these are the yields in bushels per acre of these different varieties. Channels on the top, Proceed on the bottom, fixed or blue, red or flexed. And the thing that we'll be spending the winter thinking about is that we didn't see what we expected to see across these different ear types at the different populations. It's more variable than we were expecting. And so what are we going to do with that? Well, we're going to repeat it in 2025 at Mandan and Hettinger, and we'd also like to put in a couple of sites in eastern North Dakota for that idea of a less water limited environment and see how these genetics perform in those areas. Because really my question that's hopefully going to be useful to farmers in western North Dakota is, are we getting value out of a flex versus a fixed ear type, especially at these lower populations? And knowing in western North Dakota, can you maximize your yield at, say, 14, 18, maybe 20,000 plants per acre? You don't need to spend that money on 26 or 30,000 plants per acre. All right, and so I am out of time. We're going to continue this work, and then additionally, we'd love to work with the Corn Council in the future to improve fertility recommendations.